Well, playing the violin normally is such a wonderful experience, and a hill fine tuner is the finest. It's only the finest when it's manufactured, installed, and maintained properly. If it's not, it can really ruin the mood. So let's take care of all of that right now. Never be tempted to put oil on your fine tuner's threads, or you risk it spreading and ruining the finish on your tailpiece, or even worse, the varnish on the belly of your violin. The very best lubrication for fine tuners and bow screws has always been, at least for over 100 years, Naptha soap. And the bars you buy today may look a little different and come in different packages, but it's still the hard yellow soap. And what I do is cut off a small piece. In fact, a piece this size will last about 20 years. So don't worry about the cost of the soap. And all you have to do, if everything else is right, is to totally remove the screw of the fine tuner, back it all the way out, swipe the threads a couple times on the soap, and that gets the soap down inside the threads. Maybe blow off the excess. Thread it back into the fine tuner, and I can feel that this is tight threading it back in. So we're going to have to do a bit more work on this fine tuner before we're done. But for now, if everything is right, simply thread it back down, and it does feel a bit better. Tune back up your E string, and you're good until you go to replace your next set of strings, or until it starts tightening up again. Now, if you're really desperate and you simply can't find any Naptha bar soap right away, you can use regular bar soap to get by, or even Hill Peg compound. But wipe that completely off, and when you're able, make sure you find some Naptha bar soap. Oh, wow, that really tightens right back up when I go to put the screw back in, which means we do have some work to do. Also, when you go to unscrew your fine tuner screw, don't be surprised if towards the end it cinches right up and gets tight. And you can usually just, if your fingers are a little tough, pull it all the way out anyway. If it gets real tight, you may even put on a glove and try a little harder, but don't try too hard to where you might risk cracking something. Then you just have to take it to a violin shop. Or, if you're brave, you can put something soft, like a business card, over the top and use a pair of pliers, very careful not to hit anything or scratch anything, and undo it the rest of the way. But then, if it does cinch up tight, you're really best to take it to your local violin dealer. The reason this happens is the end of the thread can get smashed over time, especially when the fine tuner isn't made right, which it almost never is. So I'll pull this out all the way, and if you take a very close look, you'll see that the end is flattened out and slightly smashed. And if this is the case for you, you don't need to throw away your fine tuner and buy a new one. We just need to reshape the tip of the screw so it's close to what it was when it was new. And you can use almost any kind of file, usually the finer the better. You can even use a fingernail file if that's all you have, but don't use a nice fingernail file because it may rough up the surface a little bit. And you just hold the screw at an angle to the file and swipe it and keep rotating while you're filing. That way it makes the tip nice and round. It also helps if you move the file away from the end of the threads, in other words, this direction as you're filing. And after a few minutes, you should be able to get a nice cone shape on the end. If when you go to put it back in, though, it's still tight, you may have to shorten it a little bit and then refile it. If you find that one side is flatter than the other, just take a good look and then file the other side until the tip resembles the original one. And most of the time, when you go to put it back in, it'll now be a lot easier to turn. And wow, this one really is. If it isn't easy to turn, you may have to shorten it a little bit more or file back on the sides of the threads a little bit further, and then it should go in easily. And you can do that 2 or 3 times before the screw becomes too short and you would need to buy a new fine tuner or screw. Though, as this one bottoms out and starts moving the arm up, it gets hard to turn again. And we'll take care of that in just a few minutes. In order to go any further, we now have to remove the fine tuner. To do this, as shown in my other videos about replacing strings, we need to take the E string off altogether. Make sure you don't handle the string with dirty hands. Set it to the side. And now remove the nut around this shaft that comes up, the post. But before you undo it all the way, get a small piece of paper. I like little square stickies for a lot of things on the violin because they hold it in place and don't hurt the varnish. And then undo the nut all the way and let it drop down. Now, if it doesn't come out all the way, just tip up the tailpiece a little bit and slide it out from underneath it and put it on the desk. It's usually that easy. Once again, though, if that nut were really tight, which it shouldn't be much more than finger tight, you might want to use, so carefully though, pliers and undo it, making sure to never touch the tailpiece and scratch it, or to drop it against the belly of your violin. So now we have the body of the fine tuner in our hand, and now we can see really what's wrong. But before we go there, let's take care of the largest single problem with the newer Hill style E-tuners. You see, the originals were wonderful in every way, and yet this, again, is one of those cases where going from a fine product to mass production ruined it, literally. You see, if you just take a Hill fine tuner out of the bag or box, put it on your instrument, the chances are it will break your E string. And it'll be at the worst possible time. Now, sometimes this doesn't happen because they aren't made consistently. But this corner is always way too sharp because now it's made on a punch press. And so we need to take care of that. And the way to do this depends upon whether you're doing one fine tuner for yourself or you're a shop doing dozens or hundreds of these fine tuners a year. And so let's start with the way it's normally done in a fine violin shop. And that is to take a needle file or a rat tail file, a fine one. Try not to get chips on your violin or anything. And hold it steady. Is to file that sharp corner while moving around, so you radius that inside curve so all that E-string ever sees is a smooth, wonderful, round surface. Try to use the file where it matches that size pretty close. And you can see very quickly with the file how it rounds it. And I keep moving around. I'll rotate the file slightly. Try not to hit these other threads. And I blow the chips off just so I can see what's going on. Depending on the file, you can move it back and forth and leave it in contact, though it's usually very best to go one direction with the file as you move around. And very quickly with the file, where that E-string travels becomes nice and round and smooth. Now I'm only going to do one side with the file so that you can see two different operations. And then in a large shop, I would grab a ruby file or a ruby stone. This is very fine, and you finish up, and this smooths out all those scratches of the file. And it goes even quicker when you're not making a video. If you scratch up the side a little bit, no one will ever notice, but try not to. And the combination of those can smooth that out very quickly and make it round. You only need to be round where the string comes in contact. If in doubt, go a little further. And in fact, this whole operation can be done with a ruby stone. It just takes a lot more work. So if you had to choose just one tool, choose the ruby stone. But for speed, the file to rough it out, the ruby stone to finish. And I will put links below this video on where to buy a file and a ruby stone to do this operation if you need to do a lot of them, if you're a violin teacher with a lot of students or a violin shop. The least expensive route is to go down to almost any automotive paint supply store or glass and paint store and buy a sheet of 400 grit wet dry sandpaper. I always have some of this around for doing lots of different things with metal, and cut out a small piece. Something like this. Put it around a round toothpick. And you can do the same thing. Just like the ruby stone takes a little longer. And yet the results are just as good in the end. Expect to spend about 10 or 15 minutes though with the sandpaper. Expect to go through maybe 2 or 3 small pieces. You can turn it around the other way and finish off because, as I said, this is the least expensive and almost anyone can do it within a few minutes, but it does take quite a few minutes to actually do the job. Now, when you're finishing off though, make sure to come around and go all the way around to make sure there's no little bumps or anything left. And if we now take a look at this fine tuner, this is the minimum that you want to smooth or round those corners, just like this. It's amazing how little you have to do this to reduce the risk of breaking your E string, but just to be safe, take a few extra minutes and make sure it's nice and round and smooth. And now, if you really want your Hill fine tuner to perform and last a lifetime and be smooth as glass, yet hold that intonation perfectly, let's take this operation to the next level and finish it all the way. In order to disassemble the fine tuner, it's necessary to remove a small pin that holds the arm to the body of the tuner, which is a project in and of itself. And the older ones sometimes had a tapered pin or a stepped pin, and almost all of the newer ones have a grooved pin. And regardless of what it is, the process is the same. And you will need a few extra tools or have a friend that is in a machine shop and will help you out a little bit. Because in a machine shop, they'll almost always have little pieces of aluminum laying around, different sizes, shapes. It's really not critical. And have them drill a small hole into that piece of aluminum. You can even have them drill 2 or 3 in case one gets a little smashed up by doing multiple fine tuners. And after you drill the hole, you'll want to scribe. An X marks the spot that goes right through the middle of the hole to make it easy for you to see where the center is for this next operation. We need this small hole with the crosshairs on it in order to drive that small pin out, because it's held in there tight enough to hold it forever, yet with a little force the right way, we can drive that pin right out. If it is a tapered pin, look for a larger size versus a smaller size, and you'll want to tap on the small side to take it out. And in order to get that out, you either need a small pin hardened pin to begin with, or I use piano wire. And I'll cut that piano wire off. The length isn't really critical, but about that long. I'll then grind the ends flat and then hold it in a pair of very small vice grips. You can do it any way you like or works for you, but this is what works for me. And I hang the piano wire out the one side just a little bit over halfway across the bottom of the fine tuner. That way, when we drive the little pin out, it'll stay on the other side, but it'll be clear of the arm. And you'll find that when you set the fine tuner down and go to drive out the pin, it's very difficult to keep it flat and to keep the pin on top of the dowel over the hole. In order to help this out, I'll cut just a couple pieces of duct tape. And I'll place it as far away from the edge of the hole as the pin is from the edge of the fine tuner. Each fine tuner is different, but the distance from the center of the pin to the edge the other direction is usually just a tiny bit more. And then make sure when you slide the fine tuner against the tape and against the tape that it's centered on the crosshairs. And this one happens to be just right. And with a little practice, you can do the same. And if you have to adjust the tape back and forth just a little bit to get it just right, take the time to do it. Then, with the piano wire held in the vice grips or pliers or whatever you have to work with, once again, make sure the pin is directly over the hole. Kind of hold it up, hold it centered on the pin, as close to center as you can get. Doesn't have to be exact. And then we'll hammer it out. It's a little bit firm, but as you can see, The pin is now sticking out the other side. Not quite far enough yet, and so now it's easy to set the pin back down into the hole, tap it just a little bit further, and now it looks about right. Let's see if we can pull that arm out. There it is. And even though this is one of the nicest ones I've seen in the last 50 years, this surface, hopefully you can tell, is actually rough and uneven. And let me pull apart another one so you can see how bad they actually get. Yeah, this is pretty ugly. And you can see these little knobs and nodules and what's called the shear and the tear on a punch press when they stamp this out very quickly. And that's what I was talking about, going to mass production and then losing the quality. This surface tears apart that gold screw tip and smashes it out until it doesn't take long for the tuner to feel quite terrible. The ultimate way to smooth this in a factory, or if you have a machine shop available, is with a ball end mill. And just run it across that top surface. It'll smooth it and leave it slightly concave, quick and easy after you're all set up. On the other hand, most musicians just have to do this once, possibly in a lifetime, or even small repair shops will need to smooth this different ways. There's a couple options. One is to file it smooth, very similar to the way we radiused the little hook on the arm for the E string. And yet, if you do go to file that, it's so easy to get it crooked one way or the other around the top, and it'll still work, but it is so much better if you put it into a vise so that it just barely sticks up. So think of it as kind of forcing you to file it nice and flat and even. As you can see, the surface is already 10 times better than it came from the factory. And this would work quite well, but the little scratches across from the file will still wear out the end of that screw over time. And so now we need to go the other direction with the sandpaper around a toothpick. Though this time, I'll use a little X-Acto knife blade to just cut off the tapered part of the toothpick. I can hold it between my fingers and kind of guide the sandpaper to keep it from slipping off the edges. And make sure you keep getting on fresh sandpaper by rolling the toothpick back and forth or side to side a little bit, and keep sanding on it until all those little ridges go away. Now you may have to cut off the sandpaper a couple times. Notice how I made it extra long compared to what I really need. Otherwise, the sandpaper works slower and slower over time. And this operation will probably take about 10 or 15 minutes, and yet then will make your fine tuner last for years instead of months. And that surface is now nice and smooth, and even the tiny scratches left go in the direction of the screw going across the arm. The rebuild, the repair is complete and ready to put it back together again. If you know you're going to have to pull the tuner all the way apart like this, it's also an option to round and smooth and radius the hook on the arm while it's apart. To each his own. But if you decide to do that, you can hold it in a vise and then have the freedom of both arms to radius it. On the ruby file. And remember to rotate, move around. Voila. So when you're done, wipe it off, blow it off, whatever it takes. And then it's time to reassemble it. And your pin should still be in the one side. And slide it back into the slot. And it should have just a little friction. And now we line up the hole and tap it in. And if it's still sticking out a little bit, you can use your pin that you used earlier to tap it in just a little bit more. And so the pin is all the way back in, the arm swings freely, and that screw now has a smooth, nice surface to glide along instead of smashing against and chewing up the end. So now this fine tuner should last for years. And with everything fixed and put back together on the body of the fine tuner, we now use, and you can use paper, or even better is a little piece of cardstock to set the fine tuner on. Lift up the tailpiece if necessary to get it to clear, and lift it all up back through the hole. And once the nut is started on, it can't fall back down through, and you're free to tighten it on down. The general rule is to make sure that the fine tuner is centered in the slot, and then tighten it as tight as you can by hand. If you do have an issue with the fine tuner coming loose, you can use a small pair of pliers, but it really takes experience, and it is so easy to go too tight and crack your tailpiece, and it's all over. So I suggest you don't go here, but many shops do with experience. That's if everything is right. And don't forget a couple swipes of Naptha soap down the threads. Double check the end that it looks good. And if you get a little extra soap down there, just blow it off. That's the beauty of Naptha soap, is the little pieces blow right off and don't hurt the varnish. And then tighten the screw until the arm is clear of the fret. Put the string back on and you're done. The trouble is, most instruments aren't set up quite right. And on this instrument, if you look carefully underneath, you'll see that this tailpiece has actually been carved to accommodate that fine tuner and to make sure it sits perfectly flush all the way around. Here's a brand new tailpiece, a very fine one. And notice with the fine tuner in it, it doesn't sit flat. It rocks back and forth. And if you think about it, as you tighten the screw, it'll make it want to crack the tailpiece more, or even if it tightens down and feels pretty good, your fine tuner is always rocking or moving, and so everything isn't as solid and stable as it should be. And if it's just a little bit, and if the fine tuner isn't really expensive, then just mark around the fine tuner with a pencil. Determine where it's hitting. And if you look carefully, you'll see, oh, this back corner is where it's hitting the most. And by taking a flat chisel and you just lay it on the tailpiece and carve away just a slight amount of wood. Don't carve away very much wood, or you'll really weaken the tailpiece and it can cause problems. When you get it really close, you see how it's just flattening out? There. That's about right. And now, when you put in the fine tuner, it'll sit flat all the way around. That's option 1. On a lot of new tailpieces, this section is so thin that this nut keeps the fine-tuning arm from coming back very far. So your travel is way too limited for the E string, and you find yourself having to tune up with the peg all the time and loosening it back down. In fact, this is one of those cases. This should have twice that amount of travel before it hits the nut. And in this case, we would put on a spacer underneath that looks like this, that allows that arm to come all the way back. Look at the extra travel we get now. And you don't want to tighten it all the way back, but all that extra travel makes it all that much easier to tune your E string for a longer amount of time. So if you have too thin of a tailpiece, or if it's too uneven, and it's a valuable tailpiece you don't want to carve on, we need to make a spacer. Now this spacer, or any carving of course, has to be done with it off the instrument. So I'm going to go ahead and put the fine tuner back onto the gypsy violin again, and we'll do the spacer separately. If you did decide to carve a little wood away so it's nice and even, then we'll just be making a flat spacer. And the way that's done is to take a piece of gasket paper. I'll list the specifications down below this video in the description. And this is my last piece. I just ordered some new gasket paper, so just pretend for a moment with me. And I take a piece and I will punch the holes in each of these with just a leather punch. And I'll make up enough for a few of them at a time. Once the holes are punched, then best to make the slots, as you can see, just slightly narrower than the hole. And I start by just lightly scribing it, and then work a little deeper. And after 3 or 4 times, that piece will come out. Then you can put the fine tuner up through there. You can mark the other side with pencil or pen or anything you like. And have a rough outline drawn. Then take a knife, and you don't have to follow the lines exactly. And if anything, make it slightly larger than the fine tuner. You can curve it if you'd like the fine tuner is. Went a little bit wild right there, but we can carve it down. But take your time and take a few swipes to make each of the cuts. Otherwise, you can actually break off pieces or distort things more than they should be. Okay, then it comes free. And then once you have that spacer, comes up through, and you can decide whether you want to trim how good a job you did. You can see this is a little offset. Nothing says that you can't take it off. Trim off the end a little bit and make it match. On the other hand, if you do have an old valuable tailpiece and it is uneven and you don't want to touch it at all, in order to even it up, put in the fine tuner, see how it rocks or where it's uneven, and so what I do is take a little two-sided tape, put it down on the cutting mat, press the gasket paper against the two-sided tape, make sure you're going to the right area, there, and then use a blade to cut the taper on the spacer. Then lift it off. Put it back together and make sure as you tighten it up, it's nice and even and doesn't rock at all, then tighten it down. In fact, as you tighten it down, make sure that it's not dragging on the side of the arm. Oh, this one is just a little bit. So, let's see. I'll just push it out a little bit with my pencil to make sure it clears. Tighten it down nice and tight. And now you can see that that arm has all the travel in the world. Then it would go back on the violin, string it up, and smooth as glass, will last for years, and you'll truly see why the Hill Fine Tuner has always been the most wonderful of all. Now it's as smooth as glass and the right way to set the stage for a wonderful attitude and beautiful music.